Bias in Recommender Systems: How Personalization Algorithms Create Prejudicial Filter Bubbles. By Brendan Fox, Derek Reich, Jaime Sanborn, and Benji Wilson.
Entertainment technology uses real-world analytics to determine user preferences and make recommendations. This is true for Netflix, Spotify, Kindle, and Audible. What all three of these services have in common is that they use collaborative filtering to generate recommendations.
Collaborative filtering uses similarities between users and items simultaneously.
However, the algorithms used to make these recommendations have become all too human.
We as citizens need to hold algorithm developers and users accountable to ensure that the benefits of machine learning are equitably distributed. Young, 2021.
For this assignment, we chose the case study, Feedback Loop and Bias Amplification in Recommender Systems by Mansouri et al. This study shows how the feedback loop phenomenon increases bias in recommender systems and how that decreases diversity in recommendations across users. It alters the tastes of users over time and creates a monochromatic experience for users, limiting their ability to discover media from marginalized perspectives. This feedback loop not only is biased towards more popular suggestions, it tends to heavily impact minority groups.
A feedback loop is a self-fulfilling cycle. An algorithm makes a popular recommendation and omits less well-known ones. A user then likes or interacts with that recommendation, strengthening its status as popular. Therefore, it continues to be suggested to the exclusion of other content.
Some key words to understand for this study are recommender systems. That's an information filtering system that tries to determine the rating users would give to a particular item. Feedback loop, which for this study means a popular item gets suggested, therefore it gets more user interaction, and so it becomes even more suggested. An algorithmic bias, algorithms respond to human behavior, and since humans are inherently biased, the algorithms actually learn to become biased themselves. And then popularity bias amplification, and that's when a data bias towards popular items causes recommender systems to suggest popular items to users who actually have no interest in those items. So this study began with a feedback loop simulation. And the feedback loop simulation was conducted in an offline setting. It wasn't feasible to do it online. Over time, by generating recommendation lists for users and then updating their profiles based upon the recommendations. Each user's profile was then subsequently updated based on the generated recommendation lists and the probability that they would be accepted by the user. This was done repeatedly throughout the entirety of the simulation.
The whole process is sort of like a snake eating its tail.
To give you an idea of the power of a feedback loop, I'm going to make a tie-in to a real-world event, and this is a particularly dangerous one. A YouTube user named Matt Watson discovered that YouTube's algorithms were actually making it easier for pedophiles to connect with other pedophiles and share child pornography. And then the pornography was actually being monetized via YouTube. And the algorithm, this recommendation algorithm in YouTube, was actually pushing these users towards other suggestive videos of children. Now, of course, none of this is being done on a conscious level. It's all being done via algorithms. But this is the danger of not monitoring these feedback loops and not visualizing data. So getting back to our study, the next portion of the study, they actually modeled these feedback loops. They used a mathematical equation to model the effect of feedback loops on algorithms over time. And what they discovered was that the algorithms learned to intensify their bias and create filter bubbles for the users, narrowing the user's interaction with any content that was outside of that bias, limiting their perspective, limiting what they're exposed to. And that's called popularity bias. It is a direct result of the feedback loop phenomenon. And the feedback loop phenomenon, algorithms recommend popular content, reinforcing and intensifying the content's popularity. To give you a real world tie in as to how popularity bias affects us, there was a 2021 study done on music streaming services like Spotify. And that study discovered that these services have innately sexist algorithms. Out of the 330,000 users that were analyzed, only 25% of the artists that they listened to were female. And when the algorithm was tested, they discovered that it was because tracks by men were the ones that were constantly being pushed forward. And so they're the ones that had the most user interaction. Another real world tie in for popularity bias actually happened within the Amazon corporation. Now, this wasn't related directly to the entertainment industry, this had to do with their HR recruitment process. The algorithms were taking anything that said woman or women or related to women and downgrading it, penalizing it, and putting it below applications that were coming in from men. So therefore, they had to scrap that algorithm altogether and come up with something new. So, the actual experiment performed in our study investigated the effect of feedback loop on amplifying bias in recommender systems. Due to the lack of access to real world platforms for experimentation, they simulated the recommender system process over time in an offline setting. The simulation used 3 recommendation algorithms on a movie lens data set. Now, movie lens is a collaborative filtering technology. They make movie recommendations, but it was created by the Group Lens research team at the University of Minnesota for the purpose of studying recommender algorithms. The Group Lens research team gathered 6,040 movie lens users, and they all rated movies. There were over 1 million ratings performed. There were more ratings made by men than women, and altogether there were 3,706 movies rated. The scale was between 1 to 5, with 5 being the best, and the movies were genreified. Some of them had a few different genres, but there was a total of 18 genres altogether in the study. The researchers used 3 different algorithms for this study, and the one that we're really focusing on the most is the third one, which is most popular, and that does what it says. It recommends the most popular items to everyone, and those are the popular items that a user has not yet seen.
So now for the results of the experiments, it showed that when the most popular algorithm was employed, the existing bias was dramatically increased, and the aggregate diversity, which is diversity across all of the users, was almost non-existent.
They also discovered that the amplification of bias actually had the power to change user preferences. So their preferences at the beginning of the study were markedly different from those at the end of the study. Not only were they different, but they were incredibly monochromatic in nature. They also discovered that the overwhelming bias toward men in the suggestions caused the female participants' user preferences to change. They more closely mirrored the suggestions, thereby causing them to rank movies with men as the main focus, preferably over those of women. So they actually had the power to change, quote unquote, the women's opinions from the beginning of the study to the end. Now, this bias towards men, it's not unique to this study. And the fact that the women changed their preferences is indicative of a greater societal problem. So, according to the Times of London, in reference to Spotify, fewer females are presented in the recommendations, but also in the rankings. It's mostly male artists that come first. What users are presented with gets attention. If you're presented first, you get more attention. And that speaks to a larger societal problem. So the study concluded that even the smallest bias can cause a lack of diversity of recommendations across user populations. It can change the preferences of users towards popular recommendations and homogenize user groups. Women, they were the minority group in this study, they were more heavily impacted by these recommendations than the men were. It actually changed the way they ranked movies. Therefore, according to the study, algorithmic solutions to tackle popularity bias, to fight this, are of great importance and are essential to increasing diversity in the recommendations. To conclude with a real world connection, the recommender systems used by companies like Netflix, they're constantly changing and evolving. And Netflix is very transparent about this. In their description of their recommender systems, they say figuring out how to bring unique joy to each member. They're not saying they've got it figured out, they're saying they're still working on it. So no one has it all figured out. But in order to avoid sexism and racism and all forms of bigotry, they have to continue to try. To learn more about bias in recommender systems, feel free to visit our references or the additional readings listed at the end of this presentation. Thank you.